have poet George Curtis in conversation with Shudip Sen and Ranjit Hoshkote. I will briefly introduce them. I know we do not have the culture of introducing people much here, but I think it's important to read the bios and know about people. So I'll read about George first. George Curtis is a British poet and translator born in Budapest, Hungary, 1948. He has published several poetry collections, including new and collected poems published in 2008. Curtis has won numerous awards, including the T.S. Eliot Prize. He has been shortlisted for the Forward Prize, the Griffin Poetry Prize. In addition to his poetry, Curtis is also a translator of Hungarian literature into English, for which he was awarded the International Book for Translation in 2015. I would like to introduce our poets here on stage. Shudip Sen's prize-winning books include Postmarked India, New and Selected Poems, Rain, Ladakh, Arya, the HarperCollins Book of English Poetry, Fractals, New and Selected Poems, Translations, 1980 to 2015, Aerotext, Kaifi Azmi, Poems and Nazms, Anthropocene, and Red. He is the editorial director of Arc Arts, editor of Atlas. The Government of India awarded him the Senior Fellowship for Outstanding Persons in the Field of Culture and Literature. Sen's is the first Asian to be honored to deliver the Derek Walcott Lecture at the Nobel Laureate Festival. I'll introduce Ranjit, sir, for you all. You can be generous and clap for everyone once they're introduced. Ranjit Hoshkote is a poet, translator, cultural theorist, and curator. His collections of poetry include Vanishing Acts, Central Time, Jonah Whale, Hunch Prose, and Ice Light. Hoshkote's translation of 14th century Kashmiri women's mystic works have appeared as I, Lalla, the Poems of Lal Ded. He has received the Sahitya Academy Golden Jubilee Award, the Sahitya Academy Prize for Translation, the S.H. Raza Award for Literature, and the 7th JLF Mahakavi Kanhaiya Lal Sethia Award for Poetry. I welcome you all, and sirs, you may please start the session.
Welcome, George. Very good morning to you. And it's a hot, humid, sultry afternoon in Auroville. And we miss your presence here. It would have been fantastic if you were part of the live audience. But in any case, this is wonderful to have you.
It is wonderful to see both you and Ranjit together. I wish I could be there. Just for health reasons, I couldn't go. But it's lovely to be with you now. And it's very cold Sunday morning.
Yes, I can see you zipped up in your fleece.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's marvelous, George, that we're celebrating your new and collected poems. And it might be a thought for us to go directly into the poems. So if you could read some of them, and then maybe we go into a conversation. Could we invite you to read from the book?
Yes, of course. Thank you for asking. Yes, I'll read a few poems from quite a long time ago, but which go back to a crucial period of my life when I first returned to Hungary in 1984. I shall read excerpts from some longer poems. The first of them is called The Courtyards. One of the things that characterizes Budapest are tenement blocks, rather beautiful 19th century tenement blocks with courtyards in them. And the noise in the courtyard is completely different from the noise of the street. And it's like entering a private world. In this poem, there's a specific person who I am meeting really for the first time, but who had been a good friend of my mother's, an elderly blind woman who, as she comes to open the downstairs door for us, has to let down a key on a long piece of string from the drawn into a state of grace, as if the sun had moved out to the country or had gone abroad, as if the shadows had grown old and grey or found their recesses too cold and spread themselves across a civic lawn. Then what is left? I see the woman grip the handrail as she feels her way along. She clutches fervently a ball of string, an old steel key. She turns a corner, calls to someone downstairs, and a steel key falls suspended like an odd metallic trip. As if the past could ever lose its teeth. As if the eye could swallow everything and leave the world in darkness, blundering about the courtyards. As if all the words not spoken here would congregate like birds and block out the faint noises from beneath. Uncertainly, she calls out from the top of the thin stairs. The key won't fit the lock. The key won't turn. The key is firmly stuck inside the door. Then how to get up there? I'd run up every story by the stair and hope she'll still be there when the stairs stop. And hope she'll still be there when the stairs stop. The old woman was... shall I read one more?
Yes, please.
Okay. The old woman was a friend of my mother's, and both she and my mother survived the war, although with great difficulty. And the idea of making contact with the past as something that is dangled in front of you and which won't simply open the door, but you have to run upstairs and you can't get into the lift, the difficulty of the past. This second part is from the longest poem I think I've ever written, called Metro, which is about revisiting Budapest. I love Budapest. I love cities in general, but I love Budapest particularly. And Budapest is absolutely an anthropomorphic city, full of statues everywhere, which the first verse of the poem mentions. And then the second version talks about what is under the surface of the building, under the pavement, and how one comes to get to know them as best one can. This is part 2 from a Metro called Undersongs. I love the city. The way it eats you up and melts you into walls, along with stone and stucco, till your voice assumes a tone as crinkled, crenellated, creviced as itself. And you can recognize it in a shop like something heard through windows. Human forms, detailed and allegory, the 12 months of the year, the forces of nature, or a frieze of leaves and angels, where the worms have eaten away the substance of a voussoir above a flaking open door. A spray of lace or foam, a mouchoir in plaster, flung at the late empire. The empire underground. The tunneling begins. The earth gives up her worms and shards, old coins, components, ordnance, bone and glass, nails, muscle, hair, flesh, shriveled bits of string, shoe leather, buttons, jewels, instruments. And out of these come voices, words, stenches, and scents. And finally, desire, pulled like a tooth. It's that or constancy that leads us down to find a history which feels like truth. The windows cannot speak because we pass before them all too often, but the bricks know what they stand on. There is no town below. I'll stop that point there. Shall I stop there or shall I read another one?
I think you can read about 2 or 3 more, perhaps, and then we can talk.
Okay, let's read a little bit more. All right, this is a poem called Esprit d'Escalier. You probably know this. This is the French expression, spirit of the staircase wit. when you've been talking to somebody, I don't know, at a party or something, and they say something and you want to say something back, but you can't think of it. And it only comes to you after the occasion for it has gone, and you're walking downstairs or up the stairs, whatever it is. And in this poem, and in front of me was a man who was talking to himself. And it seemed to me that he might be addressing somebody. And then suddenly, within the dream or within the imagination, I can't remember now, the whole bus was full of people talking to themselves, or not themselves, but to those people who they should have said something to. Suddenly, there we all were, talking together, but not to each other. It might have been I who had started it, muttering, as I do to myself, or rather to a figure to whom I have something to say in a manner known as l'esprit de l'escalier, that ghostly meeting on the staircase with a person already past meeting, for whom we now have an altogether brilliant answer, one we have always known but had failed to produce when required. And now I and the others were talking, all of us, to whom it would finally concern us to talk to, as we do each day on the bus, knowing just what to do and to say at this and every other such meeting. There were friends, fears, ghosts, and past selves, whom each of us had to answer, all of us speaking together, every which one a distinct and separate I, in a world where everything has always been known. The air was packed solid with voices we had once known or were ours. It was hard to tell which, for how do you tell the inner from the outer, or distinguish the I from the not quite I? And soon, each intimate meeting had spilled onto the street, all voices singing together to make one thundering chorus, each who with its whom, in doorways, on staircases, singing to whomsoever could hear and respond to the known or unknown harmonies we were producing, as if we were together. We were ghosts. We were dead. There was little to do but to listen and sing and be dead and be meeting each ghost on its staircase. And so it was I myself spoke to the dead ones within me, since I was their only voice, the lost hum of their womb. It was crazy, this sound. The music of meeting all of them now, there on the bus, having known only the steps to the top deck, knowing what to do only in emergencies, when we're all thrown together and have to make do as we are, no matter with whom we travel or have known, these voices, with their I, their you, they're singing together at each and every meeting. I read one more in that case.
Yes.
And all these are to some degree about remembering what was in the past. And after the publication of the new and collected poems came a collection of the newer poems, which was then divided into poems about Hungary, which was where I was born, and a second about England. And I spent a number of years trying to understand England one way or the other. I'll read you a little bit from Backwaters, Norfolk Fields, which I wrote for W.G. Sebald, the great writer, Max Sebald, who I knew, who worked in the same university as I did. And this is basically a picture of the small town where I currently live. This is a set of 12 sonnets, and I'll just maybe read. I'll read the first two sonnets. Long grass, slow speech. Far off, a truck heaves its load of rust into a yard next to a warehouse full of office furniture no one will ever use, unless to stuff some temporary room when times are hard. Across the fields, the sweet smell of manure. We're years behind. Even our vowels sag in the cold wind. We have our beauty spots that people visit and leave alone down main arterials and side roads. A paper bag floats along the beach. Clouds drift in clots of grey. And eventually, down comes the rain. We're at the end. It might simply be of weather or empire or of something else altogether. Empire, perhaps. Chapels in a cathedral, old airstrips, history's human noises still revving down a field. Clothes pegs hang like hanged men. It is all procedural. Resentment simmers in the empty houses. The wind at its eternal droning harangue. I'm wanting to mouth the word that fits the case, but it's like trying to roll a shadow from the street where it has been sitting for years. It will not go. You cannot wipe the face of the clock or restore the vanished kingdom. You feel this. Your mouth is talking to the steady light, which listens to you and remains polite. I'll stop there for now.
George, thank you so much for sharing those deeply moving poems. And maybe as a way of taking this conversation further, I'd like us to maybe dwell on an image in the very first poem you shared, which was the key being let down, the key that twists in the lock, doesn't quite open the door. Because you've been very strongly in mind through the Brexit years. I've been thinking of what this might mean for you as a poet who has made his life and his trajectory in Britain, but whose connections remain very, very strong with what you've called your shadow language, Hungarian, and with a history of Mitteleuropa, with all of the horrors and the beauties of that heritage. So could we draw you out on what this has meant, this interplay of identities or locations for you in the last few years?
Well, I came to England when I was only just 8 years old. I was 8 years and 2 days old. And then here we stayed. And my parents decided that we should speak English at home, not Hungarian, because what on earth use would Hungarian be? And you have to settle into your country. This has been such a familiar theme to so many people all over the world, I think. And so I did. I learned English really quickly. And I also forgot Hungarian. And when I started writing poetry and eventually publishing my first book back in 1979, I was just a poet. I was a poet writing about things that occurred to me. Sometimes they were things I remembered, sometimes it was stuff I saw. But then in 1983, I was given a grant to travel to Hungary for the first time in 1984. And what that did to me is it changed my entire life, because it brought another world, a kind of lost world, back into my attention, and to my thinking, into my dreams. And in a way, that long key on that long string is that. You think somewhere in there, there's this old woman who lives in a block of flats similar to a block of flats that I myself lived in as a young child. And she's offering to give you a key, or the key doesn't fit. So you have to make your way there somehow else. As regards Brexit, which I was firmly against and still am, it seemed to me a kind of turning in of the country that had actually very generously adopted me. I had no complaints about how we were treated. We came at a fortunate time, on a fortunate occasion, not fortunate for us, but fortunate at a point of British history. And so it was alienating, or at least it was potentially alienating. I mean, one discovers after a time, and I won't go on much longer, but what you discover when you stay in the second home for a long time is that you're both part of it and not part of it. Some part of you is not part of it. And the people amongst whom you live know that and recognize it. They treat you well, but you know you are to some degree a kind of intrusion from another space. And however nice they are, as I say in that English poem, which listens to you and remains polite, which is the wind in that case. But that is exactly it. So yes, it's complicated, and I think the events here in the country leading up to and through and then beyond Brexit have been disturbing to me.
Yeah, I think the metaphor of the key is critical. I'm going to use the word key and take it to another level, perhaps, because the keys of the piano, the auditory quality in your poetry, the oral quality of your poetry, as in A-U-R-A-L, as well as the O-R-A-L quality of your poetry, because in a sense, I don't think of you as an English poet at all. I think of you as a truly world poet, which is a rarity in England, I think. Partly because a lot of your subtle references and cross-references and the intertextual elements in your poetry are very un-English, I think, the way you use it. So I want you to dwell a little bit on the sound aspect of your poetry, because I will get into prosody later, because we don't talk about prosody enough. But the sound is very closely aligned to the
trace of accent that people can hear. So getting my mouth around the English vowels and the English, some of the consonants, the thirds, the were, and so forth, these were to some degree exotic to me. And I think, in some respect, the whole language, in a residual way, has retained a certain degree of exoticness. And interesting, the lovely thing you say about, world poetry. You know what Theresa May said? A citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. So that was a Tory view. That was the Brexit view of such things. As for sound, what helped a great deal is, I didn't start out as a particularly formal poet, but I became so sometime during the mid to late 70s. And in a way, having the, not the metronome so much, but having the music of prosody has been a help in forming the sounds generally, because in a way I can think of the sounds falling within a unit. And I love the sounds. I think it's very interesting listening to Hungarian by comparison, because Hungarian has no diphthongs. It is all flat, clear vowels. And when you hear the contrast between the two, it is striking. And it makes the English vowels seem like a rather wonderful instrument, which you can enjoy saying. It's one thing I used to say to people when I taught them, is just listen, listen, listen. Listen to the sound, not only the sound of a poem you're reading, but the poem you're writing. Hear it. So in that respect, it has been and continues to be a kind of rather strange and wonderful zoo that you wander into.
Also, the whole metrical aspect of your poetry. If I can request you to read one of my favorite poems, Geometry. It's on page 502 of the collected poems.
let me just get the poems out. Thank you for the guidance through the page number. Yeah, okay, I can do that. To be divided out of the morning into the falling sun, where no one was around on the empty grass that glowed in the heat of itself, was to be a shape as close to a self as possible. I was watching her hands, the tiny degrees of her fingers as they sat in the air, then moved to divide it into perfect forms. A pair of shoes by the table, the forms of the body occupying weightless air, the perfect circles proceeding by degrees to describe as closely as possible what it meant to be a shape, this shape, which was a loved shape that glowed wherever anything and everything was, in a falling sun, in a dangerous morning.
Ah, beautiful, beautiful. And the reason I asked you to read that is because A, architecture and geometry are such important, crucial elements in your poetry writing. The architecture of poetry itself, the form, the meter. I'm particularly, of course, I mean, I follow you on Facebook, and you're prodigiously regular every day. And your recent designs, those 10-line poems, 331. I wanted to tell us a bit more about it. What fascinates you as far as that new form? It's not a new form, but that particular chosen form. Design is a 10-line poem.
There are 3 haiku. Numerically, I know a haiku is a far more sophisticated and complex form. But 3 times 17 syllables plus 5 syllables. I wanted to explore brevity, see what you could do with brevity. Oddly enough, it started with Twitter as it was then, which had only offered, I think, 140 characters. And I was fascinated to see what you can do with 140 characters. So I wrote countless little narrative fragments, and I began to write short form poems. And then Twitter expanded to 280, which allowed for more space. And then I thought, well, this is interesting, because every time the space you create, or the space that's available, determines something of the pace at which you think, and the pace at which you feel. And one becomes, in a way, more epigrammatic. But the process of these poems is the same as any of the other poems. You start somewhere with a broad sensation. You move into your second line, and as you move through, you are listening out for those points of transition or transformation, when you think, this is now taking me beyond what I had been thinking, and it is taking me into an area which I had not known before. And that's the exciting part. So these are, if you like, very small micro forms of discovery. Yes, so I've been exchanging a Hungarian poet with whom I'm currently collaborating. Very good. She became very fond of these things, and she christened them tenku, as opposed to haiku, which I think is very clever of her. So we've been exchanging tenku about things. So yes, that's how it came about. It came about because a space became available. I think I'll just say one more thing. I don't want to say too long an answer to any single question, is that, and there are various forms and spaces poets can work in. I mean, there are, if you like, received ones, and there are the ones which you create for yourself, but which still have a certain visible architecture. The point of the visible architecture is not to fall in line with it. It's to use it as counterpoint, to move against it, to create tensions within it. And whether that's a really long form, terza rima, long terza rima, sonnet sequences, canzoni, or little ones like epigrams. I mean, they're joys. I love these things. They keep one writing because they offer one spaces that one may enter. And so that's a temptation. By the way, I think of those daily little bits of writing I do. I was thinking about this the other day, and I kind of think of them as small spiritual exercises in which you say, well, here's something I must go through during the day. I cannot quite tell which of the spiritual exercises, if any, becomes a poem, but they are all approached as possible poems, and they are all open to expansion.
It's such a wise and a beautiful exposition of your practice, George. Also, we're struck by the fact that, of course, stanza in the Italian also means a room. You're entering a room, you're creating it as you go along. But I thought what we could do also is to, whilst we're thinking of scale and architecture, I wonder if we could draw you out on another end of the scale and another part of your practice, which is translation. I mean, you have devoted a lot of time and effort and attention to the work of novelists and translating it from the Hungarian into English. Laszlo Krasznahorkai, Sándor Márai. That calls for a very particular kind of dedication and a standing outside of oneself. And whilst we're talking about the more minimal forms premised on brevity, this is another kind of expansive, another kind of scale, an expansiveness. Could you talk to us about how this journey began for you as a translator of fiction?
Yes, it all goes back to 1984, the year I first went back to Hungary, and that changed my life because up till that time I'd been a visual artist and a poet. I stopped being a visual artist and I started being a translator, and have been translating since. But it began with poetry. So on the very last day of our first stay, there was a party which somebody kindly threw for us, the British Council, and a Hungarian editor asked me, could I translate, I think it was 4 poems by a marvelous early 20th century poet called Kosztolanyi. I said yes, with the proviso that my Hungarian is incredibly rusty and I will need help. And they offered help, so I translated those 4 poems, and they were virtuosic poems, formally virtuosic poems. So I did them, and 2 of them came out well. It went on from there. He was the editor of a magazine at that time called the New Hungarian Quarterly. And every quarter he would ask me to translate more poems. And I did so gladly. I was learning for them. As to what I was learning, I can, if you want to, we can have a word about it after, but I'll just finish this part of the story. And sometime about 1986, somebody gave me a 19th century verse drama called The Tragedy of Man, which is Hungary's kind of national epic. And he asked me to translate that. So I did that. That took about 2 or 3 years. In the meantime, people started asking me to revise books, old translations of works of fiction. So I did, but I didn't find it a very satisfying practice, because once you start doing that, you actually want to rewrite the whole thing. So then I did start to translate the whole thing. One novel followed another. I suppose I've been chiefly with 1, 2, 3, 4 main writers, novelists. The last, and probably the best known to foreign readers abroad, being Laszlo Krasznahorkai, whose style is extraordinarily long sentences, no paragraphs, and very close reading. And so that's how it went. In about 2015, I translated the last of the Krasznahorkais that I was going to do. And I said, I'm going to take a break from fiction. And I have. I've been chiefly concentrating on poetry because my books of poetry that I had translated had continued to come out at the same time of contemporary Hungarian poets. In fact, there's one due out next year. But then this year, just about a month ago, I picked up a memoir by the very first man who asked me to translate, who is a man called Miklos Vajda. And it's such a wonderful memoir. I've set to translating it because I think it ought to be read. So that's this fiction story with the parallel poetry.
Let me take you to another aspect of your literary personality, which is writing for children.
Yes.
And that requires an incredibly studied space because you think writing for children would be easy. But on the contrary, certainly I find it very, very difficult because we think as adults, we think as mature, poised, sort of, the brain wants to create artifacts of sculptural objects. Tell us which part of your brain and heart and body helps you to write for children, and how and why did you even do that?
Well, because I had children. And then I had grandchildren. It's as simple as that. I'm trying to entertain them. I was playing with putting together a book of very silly poems. My grandchildren know me as Papa, and the title would be Papa is Silly. And they're a pleasure to write. I don't really know. I'm not fully aware of the age of child I write for, but it helped a great deal having children of a certain age and not having grandchildren of a certain age. Beyond that, I wouldn't know whether I was writing for 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, or whatever. I write the things which amuse me. And I've translated poems for children by some great, wonderful Hungarian poets. Sort of playful things. And I've written, maybe 4 books for children. But our children are now aged 50 and 46, and grandchildren are 13 and 11. So I don't know how long a career I have got as a children's writer.
Do you miss your fine art practice because that's what you were trained in, and your wife, partner, is a wonderful artist who pretty much does all the book covers of yours? And so is it a lost love? Is it a lost lover? Is it something that you want to get back to? Does it visit your poetry? Where does art fit in?
Well, the first thing people used to say about my poems over the first 4 or 5 books, and sometimes they still say it, they said they are very visual, and you can tell that this person has been or is very interested in visual art. The fact is, I didn't go to university. I was studying sciences at school, and because one of the sciences went badly, I picked up a bit of extra time to do art and fell in love with art. So I didn't know how good I was, but I found, surprisingly, that I could draw. So I went to art school, not particularly to the pleasure of my parents, but that's what I did. And then for a while I was painting and writing poetry. I'd started writing poetry first, and then, as somebody who'd just begun as a poet, started doing art. I'm not my best art was never based upon looking at the world and responding directly to its forms. My best art always came out of the imagination, and out of the formal imagination, but in my head. So I never had any great confidence in it. I had an exhibition back in 1970, and then was in another group exhibitions. But I was never particularly successful as an artist, and I can see why. I think in any case, Clarissa, my wife, to whom geometry was dedicated, by the way, is a far better artist, completely different artist from me. I couldn't do what she does. I don't think she would do what I did. Do I miss it? Yes. I've lost confidence in my ability to do it properly, because what I would expect of myself now is not what I can do without very much practice. Same way as I play piano, not particularly well, but I used to enjoy it, and now I'm less patient with myself.
George, I want to circle back to something that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, your connections with Central Europe. Again, something that I've thought about over these last few years, as across the world we see the rise of populist authoritarian forms of rule. And even as we're discussing the possibilities of Weltliteratur, world literature, the possibility of being a world poet, there are particularities of allegiance that commit us to particular places and their destinies. So could we draw you out on the arc of your feelings about your homeland, in a way, a country with which you have very, very strong emotional and psychic and cultural ties, and everything that has happened there in terms of its descent once again into a fascist politics?
Yeah, well, when I went there in mid-1980s, it was still in the old imperium. Basically, it was part of the Warsaw Pact, it was part of the Soviet Empire. But it was clear from the first moment I arrived that things were loosening. And we went back to Hungary every year, 3 times for longer periods. And in 1989, for 9 months. I mean, that was the year when everything was changing, falling apart, reconstructing itself. And it was very exciting. I mean, particularly for me, because I thought, here's a place that had been, if you like, it was in servitude, and it was becoming freer. So I thought it was a very good thing. And I knew a good number of people who were involved in the new politics. They're part of the political underground. We stayed in the flat of one of the people. We knew the person who was to become the president of the country. And so it went from 89 to 90. And what slowly became clearer is that the impression that I had gathered in all that time in Budapest was far from complete, and that there were aspects of the country and its people that were very different, and I didn't know them. It was those people, and they were a mixed bunch. I wouldn't call them fascist at that stage. I'm not sure if I still would do that exactly, but that is a tendency. They were nationalists, and they were very traditional and very conventional, and they wanted to restore all kinds of old things. Hungary is absolutely full of nostalgia for one or other golden age, although there have been very, very few and very short. So the nostalgia is all the greater. And as time has gone on, the dispensation, which I left in 1989, was falling apart, partly because it was incoherent. So what we tended to call then a kind of liberal left dissolved into two sets of liberalism: economic liberalism and social liberalism. And they were different things. It's all technical. I don't want to get too much into that. It would take up too long. But little by little, especially from about the turn of the millennium, the balance of the country began to tilt. And this prime minister we've got now, Viktor Orban, who I actually saw in 1989 making a speech at a revolutionary moment, he began to remake politics after his own image, I suppose. I won't go into all the details, but many, many aspects of the country were taken over by an ideological group of people who could appeal to, and you use the word populism, and in a way it is, because they do have a popular following. But of course, it made it almost impossible for anybody else to compete with them. They took over media, they took over banks, they took over educational institutions, they took over cultural institutions, and they deprived opposition of a proper voice. And the EU has recognized this. So elections themselves are fair at the point of voting, but they're not fair at the point of campaigns, because there's very little to build on. So I fear my connections with Hungary, which was actually quite passionate through the 80s and 90s. And, you know, through those periods, that passion carried me through an awful lot of the writing. And I don't see that now. Other people I knew, of course, well, they're older, they're dead. They are survivors. The major reputations of the 70s and 80s are not much talked about because they're politically inconvenient. Well, this is a familiar picture, and you see it kind of evolving in a great many places. And it's an interesting question to ask why there should be this great resurgence of reactionary, populist, autocratic governance, and why people should want these things. And I don't really know the answers to that. One can hazard guesses, but that's all they are, they're guesses.
George, we have to wind up fairly soon, so perhaps one more question or a couple. I want to talk about representation. Representation in terms of language, representation in terms of nationhood. You, as an editor and anthologist, have done a lot of service to Hungarian literature, poetry. My access to a lot of Hungarian poetry is through the big fat Blood Axe anthology that you did, the Colonnade. I'm forgetting the title, but it had Colonnade in it.
Colonnade of Teeth.
Yes. You have been to India many times. You have a huge fan base in India. And I want to ask you, why is it that in America and England, foreign poetry travels so poorly, or not at all, or very scantily, unless someone takes it upon themselves to do these anthologies, but even then, they don't get noticed in that sort of mainstream way. After all, we are speaking a world language, and English and American English are only 1/10 of the world's speech population when it comes to English.
Well, yes, what you say is true. But even if you put together an anthology, you then have to find a publisher, and the publisher has to be able to distribute it, and the press have to take notice of it. And it is a struggle. That's a fight. Every so often, for actually non-literary reasons, translated literature may become popular and in the public eye. I say political reasons. It's partly to do with what's in the news. So Central Europe was a point of interest politically up till the change of regime in '89. And then as it became more Western, it became less interesting. Then you had the Middle East, China. So you have these periodic interests in a literature because people are interested in the circumstances generally. As concerns the primacy of English, I mean, in a way, the success of English and American English is the problem, because wherever you go, you find people who speak English. And so English assumes a kind of naturalness that, well, of course, somebody here is going to speak English. And they don't think consciously of imperial power or of any kind of power. They just assume it becomes a natural thing. So I think also foreign languages are badly taught on the whole in England. I don't know about America. French and German, I mean, these things, the university at which I work no longer teaches German degrees. It did Scandinavian degrees. It will offer some classes in these things, but they will not be degree subjects. So in a way, we are trapped. English American English, to some degree Australian English. I don't, you could tell me far more about Indian English than I would ever know. But they are all, their particular histories. I mean, Indian English must be part of imperial history, I suppose, and then the way people respond to it. And you're also a country with so many languages. In England, we don't have many languages. We have several dialects, we have several usages, but we don't have a completely different language apart from Celtic or Gaelic or whatever, and hardly anybody speaks those. Even the people who live in those countries have had to be taught to relearn them, to value them. History, we go back to history. This is all part of history, I think.
George, as we close the session, I wonder if you would read to us one of the Black Sea sonnets. That's page 438. Because somehow, a poet on the Black Sea immediately makes us think of Ovid, the poet in exile. Then you think of Mandelstam, thinking back to Ovid. And maybe this is an existential condition for poets today, to be in some kind of internal exile.
Do you want me to read the whole 438? Oh, yes. Which of the sonnets would you like to hear?
Whichever one you would like to present today.
Okay.
Speech.
Speech. Okay, let's read speech. I visited Romania several times over the last 15, 20 years. And Romania has a very close, if hostile, relationship with Hungary and Hungarians. They're all very nice to me. We're neighbors, so you know how it is with neighbors. And competing neighbors at that. And I used to go to this conference, which was on the Black Sea. And yes, Ovid's, a memorial to Ovid is in Constanza, which is where Ovid was, in fact, exiled. So this is speech. The noise of fear remains long after the cause, becomes itself a cause, and habits die hard. You hear it in the speeches. Watch fraught slips of paper circulate, or see a questioner pause and remain silent. The Black Sea purses its lips at the facing villas and draws us into her like a dull secret. Shall we walk in and stir the waves a little, pick a few cowries, reward ourselves for our exhaustion, feed the dogs that scamper about our feet? There are lists to cover the darkest recesses of your heart, but the wind sweeps them away. What is it clogs the arteries and blows the official files apart, reminding us the outside world exists?
Thank you so much, George.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you for the beauty of the speech, the elegance of your writing, and the humanness of your soul. It's a real privilege to speak to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a very kind invitation. It's an honor, it really is. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.